Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And welcome to our show. If you're returning, thanks for coming back. And if you're brand new, welcome. As always, if you are going to enjoy this show, please like, please subscribe, and please comment. And I'm hoping, Randall, this is going to be an episode where people will have a reason to comment.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably generate a lot of opinions.
Because this is another episode where we get political. So, what we mean by political is, why did I have a drink right in the middle of that? Sorry, that was rude.
You needed it.
I guess that's what you do when you're nervous. So, there's a difference between when we talk about politics in art and politics and our own political views. But in case everyone wants to know what my political views are, because they want to later on accuse me of being either a fascist or a communist, I'm neither a fascist nor a communist, though I guess it's really nice to know those are my options in Trump's America. I'm not a Trump supporter either. So, yeah, I am what is considered a left-of-center Democrat. So when I make observations about politics, it would be fair to say that I interpret it through a left-of-center scope. Randall, what's your political orientation?
Yeah, definitely. I'm like very lefty, very free speech, very libertine, I would say.
Right. So this episode, I don't know when you're watching this, and it's okay. But when this came out, we had both just watched the Democratic and Republican conventions, and there is a certain degree of showmanship and arts in these political formats, and it inspired the whole question about the relationship of politics to art and art to politics, and how the two of them do or do not work together. And then you said to me something last night when we were talking about it that it really just codified what the show should be about. Can you explain?
Yeah, I guess there's a big question of whether art influences politics, right? That's the question.
Yeah, and whether or not, I
because
think you were saying, does it really matter? Was that
right? I mean, does it matter? Does the art matter in the sense that it'll influence your opinion? I mean, does somebody make a movie and it changes everybody's opinion and it makes everybody a liberal, and then
Yeah,
does somebody
exactly.
make a movie and change everybody's opinion, make everybody into a conservative? I mean, the basic. There are many authoritarians all throughout history who have always thought that art is extremely influential on the public mind, and they have to clamp down on art. I mean, famously, the Nazis, Stalin, most communist regimes, they thought that art was incredibly influential. I mean, you can go to the Catholic Church, right? I mean, the Catholic Church has always used art to influence people.
Absolutely. And just to the converse, there have always been liberals, reactionaries who, in fact, the arts tend to be normally those people who are opposing authority, who think that they can topple governments and enlighten consciousnesses by creating art that questions authority. And does it work? Is that why we have revolutions and topplings of dictatorships?
Is
it because someone wrote a great poem or a great song?
That's an interesting question.
There is this weird thing going on where people in power who are authoritarians feel they need to control or use art, and the people who are not in power think that they can overthrow authoritarians with art. And the great question is this kind of like just like playing mental chess? Does it even matter? Or is this just two groups of people believing in Santa Claus? Which actually is an art form there itself to promote consumerism or Christianity. Which is that, right? I mean, actually, Santa Claus is a mythic archetype celebrated by the conservatives and by those who are not conservative. You could argue to promote either Judeo-Christian values, or Christian values more precisely, or consumerism more precisely. Our conception of Santa Claus gets clarified by advertising, by art. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to throw this one right into the mix, and I'm sorry. I'll get out of it just as quickly. But help me, Randall.
No,
I'm
you're
getting
bringing
off.
up good points. I want to say a couple things.
Please.
Most of the artists I've met in my life and I have met artists who thought of themselves as revolutionaries, like a stand-up who thinks he's gonna do a stand-up routine and you know, change the U.S. government with his stand-up routine and you know, artists like that. I've met these guys and ladies.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a lot of stand-ups right now, by the way, that are like very much socially conscious, right?
Yeah.
And they think they're going to change the world with their jokes, right?
Yeah.
Punching up is a phrase they like to say, right?
Yeah.
I've met these people and I think they're kind of like, for the most part, they're full of themselves. I mean, they think it's narcissism, isn't it? I mean, it's just, they
Well,
think
I
they're
mean,
gonna...
you've raised like a great starting point, and let's just pick on comedy for a moment, because comedy, by nature, right, attacks established norms of behavior and established forms of thinking. In a comedy, whatever is the dominant definition of normal or good or right or wrong, that gets challenged by comedy, right? That's why you have something like satire, which is a comedic attack on the system, or spoof, which is slightly kinder but still makes fun of it.
That's one way of looking at comedy. I've read other theories of comedy where the idea behind most comedy is making fun of the nonconformist. So, for instance, the Native Americans used to have some of the Native American tribes. They used to have a clown. Okay, so it'd be a member of the tribe who like sucked at everything.
Yeah.
Like he just was a bad hunter and, you know, he couldn't catch anything and he was terrible at everything. So he just acted up, you know, when he got on his horse, he'd get on his horse backwards and everybody would laugh. And then, you know, during the hunt, he'd throw his spear, like, you know, a foot in front of him and everybody would laugh. And he'd be the comic relief.
Right. And that's almost the equivalent of what you see in Europe in history, which is the court jester, the designated fool. But I would argue the beauty of the relation, and actually that's an interesting point, which is often the comic is actually can either be on the outside making fun or is on the highest level of the inside, protected by the tribe or protected by the monarch, to poke fun at other people below. So the whole punch up, punch down. But comedy is, in its nature, going to attack whatever people consider to be an established norm. And it's very weird. And comedy, I think, ever since the 50s, ever since the beginning of somebody like, say, Mort Sahl, Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor, there's this story that we tell ourselves that, you know, from the 50s and 60s, comedy really started to question and attack authority and Eisenhower and conservatism and FBI, and that comics coming out of that beatnik scene, hippie scene, Greenwich Village scene, they were really the social poets. And when you get to people like Pryor and Bruce, then all of a sudden you really get this whole, and Carlin, right? Those are the troika of the three very liberal, challenging, radical people who are changing the way a young generation thinks.
Yeah, so you just mentioned, right, you just mentioned an era of incredibly liberal, incredibly leftist art and artists.
Yeah.
And what happened? Well, Nixon got elected, Reagan got elected, Donald Trump got elected.
Well, actually, before you jump history, yeah, it is true that there's a reverse correlation, meaning, and you can see it today, whenever there is an authoritarian leader running America, Nixon, a Reagan, a Trump, even a Bush, pick your Bush, it doesn't really matter. There is always a real boon in comedy, right? Political comedy just goes through the roof. But then when you have someone like a Carter, Kennedy, Clinton, an Obama, the political comedy just kind of softens way, way down.
Right, but I'm just trying to, so you're making a point that comedy as an art form can be very reactive. Yeah, that's true. But we were talking about art influencing public opinion, and everything we've said so far seems to say that no, it doesn't influence public opinion that much.
Well, But
And
yes and no. I mean, I think that, and I want to get to the Republican and the conservative version of comedy real quick, because it's existed concurrently with liberal comedy forever. But comedy seems to be one of the least censored forms of political protest.
okay.
And maybe it goes back to what you're saying about the Indian, I cannot remember the name of that kind of character, or the court jester, that because comics are inherently clowns and fools, whatever they have to say, well, they are after all clowns. You know what I'm saying? The clown is in a safe position of criticism because a clown isn't really a threat.
Well, the clown is doing whatever's socially unacceptable. That's why it's funny.
Yeah.
And then they are allowed to speak the truth when the truth is socially unacceptable.
Right. So in
is where
comedy exists in such a marginal universe that it's not threatening on a political level.
Right. So like if I was a stand-up comic and I said, marriage is just fancy prostitution.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that's a very typical joke that somebody might make. And it's probably true on a lot of levels, right?
Right.
But if you were a politician, you couldn't say that, right?
Right. Exactly. So that's why you're right. Go on. I'm sorry.
Right. If you were a politician, you couldn't say that. But if you're a comic, if you're a clown, right, you could say things like that.
Exactly. And that's why if you look at comics have had up until I'd say 5 years ago, a pretty big free ride. Yeah, Lenny Bruce can make some pretty good arguments that he was harassed by the government. Of course, eventually he went nuts. Richard Pryor definitely was harassed by the government up to a point. Even Carlin had to deal with censorship. But so there was a period in time in America where comics were treated as inherently dangerous, but it's a pretty brief period. And then after that, if you really look at it, once a comic is successful, let's pick on Chris Rock, for example, or Jerry Seinfeld, for example, or Jay Leno, who all early in their careers were fairly critical of norms, behaviors, society. Jay Leno had a great bit that every time Nancy Reagan said, just say no to drugs, it made him want to shoot up heroin. You know, Chris Rock used to say it's called the minimum wage because if they could pay you less, they would. Maybe Jerry Seinfeld doesn't belong in this analogy, but my point is now they are the establishment.
Well, they became sellouts. I mean, that's terminology that none of the young people listening to this would ever know what that means. But basically, they got co-opted by the establishment, right? I mean, they got paid big bucks to change their tone. But you know, that's about business, though. And well, let me ask you a question, Chris.
Well,
do you think great stand-ups that you've mentioned, do you think they influence public opinion? Because I think the answer is no. That's I think art does not influence public opinion.
I would definitely say if we're talking just about stand-up comedy, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Political satire, political comedy, it's certainly there. It's present. It can make trenchant observations, and maybe to the degree that the key demographic of people who are in comedy at the time, like, I don't know, high school students, college students, grad students, young people who generally are open to comedy, it certainly might open perspectives, but I don't think it really changes ideology. Gerald Ford, Republican president, once said, all I ever need to know about the news is what I read in Doonesbury. And Doonesbury was a comic book that was theoretically to the left of center in its political satire and wasn't even particularly polite to Gerald Ford, but it kind of also really shows you that if Doonesbury, does anyone even still read Doonesbury? I don't even know if it's even
It's still being printed, I'm pretty sure.
Shizer. You know, he's married to Jane Pauley, the former anchor today. Yeah. Yeah, so what was the point about Doonesbury, Chris? Doonesbury or Saturday Night Live kind of really proved to you that comedy is just not going to be part of this. Moving forward in talking about whether or not art and politics have that correlation, we're pretty much stopping on stand-up comedy
Well, let me
and
let me
sketch
ask,
comedy because it doesn't.
let me
It's
ask you
so
another.
easy.
Let me ask you. Yeah. Well, let me ask you another question. We both seem to agree that it has very limited effect, right? These stand-ups. So why were people like Lenny Bruce? Why were they attacked by the establishment so much?
Well, because
I mean,
and it's really worthy getting into, and I would maybe hold back for just a moment, but certainly America's authoritarian control of the arts and authoritarian manipulation of the arts in America really hits its peak right after World War II to right around the end of the Nixon administration. So about between 1945 and 1975, there's about a 30-year, yeah, thank you. Math and I are not friends. There's a 30 years where the government is truly at the apex of this. And we'll get to that in a moment. But today, someone like Lenny Bruce could say all that stuff. And the only thing Lenny Bruce would have to worry about is, would the social justice warriors come after him? You know,
well, he had the Lenny Bruce.
would he be attacked? Would he be attacked for saying things that are politically incorrect? Or would he be attacked because maybe, I don't know how he conducted his lifestyle, but if he conducted his lifestyle in an untowardly way, he might have been canceled out.
Well, I think Lenny
But
Bruce.
the government wouldn't have anything to do with Lenny Bruce. I wouldn't give a crap.
Well, I think Lenny Bruce had the misfortune of being novel, right? He was too early. He was saying things that no one was saying before, no one had said before. So he caused a sensation.
Yeah.
Maybe that's pretty much the only reason he was so maligned and so
But
attacked by the authorities.
but I don't really see the legacy, man. You know, I mean, unless you say, well, Lenny Bruce spawned a legacy of people who could curse. Because Lenny Bruce has that really great monologue about how if he says fuck, and he says it like so many times, it means nothing. I think he's a great comic, not knocking the man. And I still also want to put Pryor there and Carlin. You know, they all made it so that you could satirize and attack, but too many, it shows that comedy is certainly the easiest one to negate, is just not being politically potent, in our opinion.
Well,
Would you agree?
Yes.
So let's move on out of comedy. And I want to just quickly, if you can just give me a moment, some other things I don't really feel like it's worth discussing. So we could just say, what about? I don't think theater. I have a strong background. That's my training. Theater can be political, has been political, but even when it becomes successful, like when Hair became successful in the 60s, or right now, Hamilton is the equivalent of Hair, which is, you know, a fairly left of center view of life in America. It's still being appreciated by people on all sides because the music inherently kind of nullifies, whatever, something in our culture nullifies the political potency of theater enough for it that it doesn't take any energy to say, I don't think even if theater is political, and it historically is, in and of itself, it's a threat. What do you think?
Well, I guess theater, see, there's certain art forms that are not accessible to the masses, you know, so theater is, you know, has a limited audience just because it's being done live, etc. So yeah, so it's not as large a concern to say the people in charge. I mean, I think when you're
I
getting,
will agree, like in the 1930s, you know, when there were a lot of communist socialist groups, or the Orson Wells and the Victory Theater, Federal Theater, all these groups were making political theater, Clifford Odets. Sure, there was a period in American history. You go from like the 20s right through to the 60s where there was a great political movement in American theater. But for whatever reason, you look at, say, one of the most common political plays ever made was written by Arthur Miller. Are you familiar with Death of a Salesman?
a little bit. I haven't seen it.
All right, but did you have to read it in high school or college?
No, I haven't experienced it. No.
Okay, well, Death of a Salesman is one of the most popular 20th century dramas in America. It's often taught in high schools and colleges. It's performed by community theaters. Miller wrote a number of political plays, but no matter how many, and it's a pretty clear assault on capitalism. If you're not even familiar with Death of a Salesman, are you?
But go on, go on.
But fine. For those of you not familiar with Death of a Salesman, it is about a guy named Willie Loman, who is a traveling salesman, and he has just been let go from his company. He has not told his children. He feeds his two children on the belief, his two sons, about the American dream and how it's important to, and they could be successful. And in reality, he is slowly killing himself. And his son, Biff, realizes the American dream that his father has been selling him is actually the thing that's killing him. And that, by the way, for all of those of you who teach or have learned it, yes, that's a ridiculously simplistic version of Death of a Salesman. But give me some credit. I just only have a few seconds to talk about it. But every time that's performed, for whatever reason, we don't really give a. It's never the economic system that ever gets put on trial or under review when Death of a Salesman is performed. What's instead done is it just becomes a melodrama about fathers and sons.
Yes, I think that's a great point, Chris. The artist tried to make a work that indicted capitalism, right? And nobody saw that. And people only instead see the relationship. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle. He was trying to make a work that indicted the industrial system, meat processing, the labor system in America. People just saw that meat processing plants needed to be cleaner so that their sausage wasn't infected with human.
You're absolutely right. The novel, too, is just another format. The novel, lots of great political novels written. Lots of great political novels written, and yet inherently, somehow, either they have a zero impact or they're misinterpreted. Like, I would imagine you've certainly read Animal Farm.
Yes, love Animal Farm, yes.
Right? And did you see the animated children's version of that?
I saw that too, yes.
All right, I'm going to get back. Remind me about that one later because it's going to pop up in the show. But were you in high school or college when you
I don't remember.
Middle school? I think the first time I read an Animal Farm in 1984 was in middle school, and then high school, and eventually college. But until it never is the inherent criticism of totalitarian governments, of propaganda, of class stratification in society. It's never really taught when you're dealing with Animal Farm or 1984.
Right. Well, I want to talk about. Can I mention one more work that is always misinterpreted? Is Romeo and Juliet? I think Romeo and Juliet is very obviously. It's even stated by one of the characters in the play. It's very obviously about how young people are stupid because they're so young and they have no experience in life. And if they're not careful, they'll end up killing themselves over nothing, which they do. I mean, that's the whole point of Romeo and Juliet. It's to show young people that they're a bunch of idiots and and they get all emotional about nothing. But yet, throughout time, Romeo and Juliet has been considered some sort of romance. And to top it off, when I was a kid, Romeo and Juliet was a very popular play when I was a kid, right, growing up. I mean, TV shows used to do adaptations of it all the time, but different strokes, for heaven's sake, did an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet.
There's like, 4 different film adaptations just in the last 50 years?
It was crazy. I mean, you know what? The Romeo and Juliet obsession has kind of died down now, but yeah, it was crazy for a while. But yeah, my point is like, this is a work that says something very specific, and yet nobody sees it, right? And it's not even political. Well, I don't know how political it is, but that's what we're talking about. I mean, it's like
right. So we'll just run with it for just a bit. So you have theater and you have novels, and both of these things, no matter how political the intent may be by the author, just maybe by the nature of the fact that it belongs to fine art. I don't know. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but at least I can't think. I certainly would say the next group of poetry is if you add poetry into the mix, another group full of dedicated liberals, radicals, communists, Marxists, revolutionaries. It's probably the most interesting one because Did you learn about the beat poets when you were in high school?
Yeah, so Allen Ginsberg is probably the most famous political poet, I would say, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And what legislation has Allen Ginsberg helped pass?
What?
I don't know, nothing. I think.
Right, exactly. No, but it's very true. I actually went, I came to my grad school. He was at Rutgers, and I actually heard him give a wonderful lecture on on William Blake, of all people. So he was a trained Columbia graduate. He was a proper trained poet. He was not just a folk poet. He understood meter, measure, very much so. And I remembered reading in high school Howell, and then later on American Kaddish. And I thought he and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who's actually even more out there than Ginsberg. You're right, though, but you look at the beat poets, you look at, and they were actually, it's interesting, they were coming, they had been turned on by Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, who in his time, too, was very much writing anti-war poetry during the Civil War. You look at, was it Henry David Thoreau who was imprisoned?
I can't remember. Maybe.
I think Henry David Thoreau was in prison. And again, more for his work as a conscientious objector. So all of these writers, all of these poets, they were very much to the left of center. They were very much questioning the structures of society. They were writing impassioned poems that were getting not just critical recognition, but it's almost impossible, I would argue, to go to high school in America and not at least learn Walt Whitman, probably learn Allen Ginsberg, poor Lawrence Ferlinghetti, not so much. And yet you're correct. There is something that happens.
Could I just say something? I think that
Go ahead.
I think that something that may happen is people who are politically in political disagreement with these artists, maybe they have a sort of cognitive dissonance about these works, because maybe they too are able to enjoy these works, on their own terms, but they object so strongly to the politics. It drives them crazy. Maybe. I mean, I don't know if everybody who reads Allen Ginsberg completely agrees with Allen Ginsberg's political point of view. I doubt that. I doubt that all these works we're talking about. I doubt that people agree with the political, like Death of a Salesman. Do you think everybody who's enjoyed Death of a Salesman is an anti-capitalist? I really don't.
I would argue it's kind of chicken egg, right? I mean, it's kind of chicken egg, meaning if you already hold those beliefs, then these artists' works just help articulate your own thoughts and feelings, or they dramatize your own nightmares, your own feelings. And in that sense, they affirm your own beliefs. And it's really interesting because Bertolt Brecht, probably, really strangely enough, I didn't realize we were going to wind up here. I should have seen it coming. Bertolt Brecht in the 1920s in Germany, who was very consciously working towards political theater, says one of the things that he detests about entertainment is that most popular entertainment simply affirms the values of that society. The whole point of his idea of critical distance to have an alienation effect that would keep you from being raped by the emotion of the story and keep you in a place of critical analysis. A completely different episode for the future is Bertolt Brecht. But the key point is, and I agree with Brecht, that what he was noticing almost over 100 years ago was that there is something in our art, in popular art, that just simply, instead of challenges the views of society, affirms the views of society. And that is why when you look at poetry, more than any, it's, in a weird way, I would argue poetry, more than even theater or comedy, we just put it in rarefied air. I mean, how many people, my mom, who is, I can't say her age, but my mom, who is a product of America's education system in the 1940s and 50s, can quote poems. She can quote poems, and I've noticed most people of her generation can quote poems. But with every succeeding generation, fewer and fewer Americans can quote poems. Is there any poem you can quote?
Not many.
Not many. You and I, learned men that we are, can quote a few poems, but there is something about how poetry, the focus on poetry tends to be more about emotions and feelings and far less about the things that Ginsgurg or Farrell and Getty or other poets since and who continue to write poems. Any political form of poetry, which is probably, it's been going on for a long time and continues to this day. Here in LA, they used to put them on buses. I don't know if you ever noticed this because I don't know if you take the bus, but in Los Angeles, they're very keen little short poems about growing up poor or growing up or working in industry, all of these things right on buses. And yet, I honestly think poetry is the least politically potent medium.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah.
We don't respect poets.
Well, it's interesting because poetry, I think, has traditionally been very left-wing. You know, it's been very radical. Walt Whitman comes to mind instantly. You know, I think Walt Whitman is one of the most politically radical poets of all time. And I don't, you know, how much influence has he really had? I mean, I don't know. I think Brecht is absolutely right about, you know, how you brought up Brecht's, his idea that that mainstream art or most art just reaffirms mainstream values, right? That's true, but
yeah, go ahead.
But I mean, my other point is, I think that even when art doesn't affirm mainstream values, as long as the audience finds something to appreciate in the work, they just disregard the more lefty stuff in it. They disregard the more radical stuff in it. You know,
yeah,
and remember, and
shake it off,
right? You remember, right? Remember our talk about horror movies? We were talking about how horror movies have seemed to have a right wing bent to them, and I still believe that's true even after our discussion.
Well, and that was such a good discussion, and I think we can move into film right now.
But well, let me just say, I just think that there are many probably liberals, left-wing people who love horror movies, and they just completely disregard the right-wing bent of the movies they're watching because they just love the genre. They love all the other artistry going on, you know, and the right-wingness of the movies just washes over them. They don't pay attention to it.
Absolutely right. And I think that the thing we've deliberately included one area of what I call the fine arts versus the commercial arts for this discussion, and we will get back to that area later, and it's missing on purpose. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this particular first part of the episode, since really we were talking in this episode about whether or not the fine arts have that political potency. And let's talk in the next episode about what I call commercial arts, the mainstream arts, you know, not the stuff that you're going to learn if you go to high school, not the stuff that you're never going to touch again after high school or college. Because let's be blunt, how many people read a poem once they get out of high school? How many people read novels? How many people even see plays, much less Shakespeare? For the majority of Americans, these particular incendiary or seditious works of art are what I call museum art, you know. And once you leave the museums, they're ossified. So want to continue this on the flip side. Thank you for part one. I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And this conversation will be continued. Till then.